everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Thank you, Dr. Sanjiva. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Dr. Sanjiva just yesterday and then over Zoom a week ago. And I'm very excited to be in discussion with him today because he's a man of unconventional ideas and really likes fresh perspectives, likes to play around with theories, and I think will bring a lot of new ways of thinking about Sri Lanka at the session today. So I'll get right into it. I love this book because I think it is a really, really rare item in the canon of Sri Lanka's history. It doesn't focus on the inland agrarian societies, which is kind of the traditional view of the ancient island. So I wanted to ask you, Dr. Sanjiva, why you think this version of history has endured for so long, and what's the power in your book disrupting that?
Thanks, Mimi. That's a very good question with which to start this discussion, because it illustrates how my own view of Sri Lanka has changed from what it was during my school days. You see, when we were in school, we learned that Sri Lanka was, as you said, an agrarian society. We grew our own rice and vegetables with perhaps a bit of fish and flesh thrown in, but the monks in the Mahamansa didn't talk about eating other sentient beings, so that was not dwelt upon. We had huge reservoirs and irrigation channels. We did not let a single drop of water go to the sea without irrigating the fields, and we fed our people. And I guess this was the view of most of us who grew up here in the last century, because we were not really exposed to the outside world. Now, my eyes were really opened when I sailed on the 1990 UNESCO Silk Road expedition. We can talk more about that later if you like. And then I had the opportunity of sailing with a team of scholars from different disciplines and different countries on a ship that traversed the old Maritime Silk Road. Each of these people was an expert in his or her field. We sailed on the ship, we stopped at various ports along the old Maritime Silk Road, and when we stopped, we had seminars when we met local scholars. It was an opportunity for all of us to learn and to share our knowledge. Now, one such person was Professor Adrian Lapian, who was a professor of history and an expert in maritime history from the University of Indonesia. When we came to Sri Lanka, our expedition was taken to see the cultural triangle sites, and when we visited Sigiriya, while all the others went up after we had seen the mirror wall and the frescoes, Adrian stopped at the Lion's Paw and said, "Sanjiva, I am too old to climb to the top. I am going to sit down here and wait for the others." Now, I had been to Sigiriya many times before, and so I said, "Adrian, if you are going to wait here, I'll sit down and keep you company." And the two of us got chatting. Adrian had grown up in Indonesia during their colonial period. He was fluent in Dutch, like we are fluent in English. And he said that Indonesian history writing began from a Dutch perspective. They were limited to Dutch sources, and even in the immediate post-independence period, their view was essentially from a Dutch perspective. This is what they were taught, this is what they had to learn, and any new research began with Dutch sources. This Dutch-focused view in Indonesia was very similar to the Anglo-centric view that we had in Sri Lanka, no? So, during our conversation, Adrian told me about the monuments in Indonesia. Borobudur, the huge Buddhist complex, Prambanan, which is a Hindu complex near Borobudur. And he said, these were built by the Indonesian dynasties at the time. He said these could not have been built by people who only grew rice to eat. He said they gained wealth by trade and maritime trade. And he suggested that our monuments in Sri Lanka, like Sigiriya and Polonnaruwa, actually were built from the profits of maritime trade. Okay, I stored that idea in my head. couple of days later, we had a seminar in Colombo, and Dr. Roland Silva, who was then the Director General of Archaeology, he was a great man of great learning, a great visionary. It was he who set up the Cultural Fund. He was instrumental in getting UNESCO to give World Heritage status to Sigiriya and Polonnaruwa places. And he gave us a talk, and he was telling us about the archaeological excavations then going on in a place called Mahatitha, which is what we know as Mana. And he said Mahatitha was a major port which went on from about the first millennium, and they had unearthed stuff that showed that this was a very big trading post. And he said he suggested that it is the wealth got from trading entrepôts like this that helped to build Sigiriya, Polonnaruwa, etc. And he even said that the evidence they were unearthing then, this was in 1996 and 1991, would prove that Mahatitha or Mantai, which is now Mena, was one of the greatest emporia of the Indian Ocean. This is a map of Sri Lanka drawn by Alexandrian Greek geographer called Claudius Ptolemy, about 100 years of the current era. Okay, the pointer, the red thing is not very good, but if you look up there, from the top downwards, there's Anuragramam, Anuradhapura. There's, on the right there, there's Nagadeepa. There's the Malaya Mountains. And this was round about the year 100 in the current era. So, this would show that Sri Lanka, or Taprobane as they knew it, was known to the people, the European sailors and traders, from as far back as that. So far from being a simple rice-growing society, waiting for European colonizers to come and civilize us, our people had been engaging in a big way in international trade.
Right. I'll just briefly interrupt you there.
Yeah.
So speaking of Matitha,
Yeah.
that archaeological site, I mean, we've known about it for more than 100 years. It's a very, well-known site. But to this day, it is not fully excavated, even now, after knowing about it for so long. So the emphasis in Sri Lankan history, archaeology, really skews away from the nautical, and that nautical and maritime history remains hidden. Why do you think it's still so hidden?
So with the war going on then, that disrupted all the archaeological excavations, and they haven't been really resumed with the same intensity that Carswell and the Renega and people did in the 1990s. There's a lot to be found out. Why did we not concentrate on the nautical heritage? Because sometimes you're told a story from childhood and you don't bother to think that there was something before that. Like, just for example, when we were in school, when we learned history, we were taught by the teachers, we memorized what they said, it was rote learning at its best. We went to the exam and vomited exactly what the teachers told us, and we got good marks. We were not taught to think. I remember when we were in school, one particular incident we were in the religion class, and our teacher was telling us about the story of Jonah and the whale. Forgive me, but how many of you know the story of Jonah and the whale? It's in the Christian Bible? Okay. For the others who don't know, in the Bible it says that God told Jonah, go to the city of Nineveh and preach there. Jonah didn't want to go. So he didn't want to tell no to God. So he ran away on a ship that was going to some other place. Unfortunately for Jonah, Jonah fell overboard. A big whale came and swallowed him up. And then 3 days later, after he stayed in the whale's intestinal tract, the whale came and vomited on the sea beach, and Jonah came out. So Jonah learned, don't disobey God, and he went to where God told him to go. Very good story. When we were told this story, one of my classmates said, Miss, how do we know that what's in the Bible is true? And our teacher, I still remember, Miss Mendis, she looked at him. Look at this boy. Look at this boy. He's asking if the Bible is not true. That put paid to any original thought and creative thinking on the part of my friend and all of us at the same time. And none of us bothered to question, no, is the Bible true? Is the Mahavansa true? And this is why, say for example, we were told, we all know that Anuradhapura was founded by King Pandukabhaya of the Vijayan dynasty. That is an undisputed fact. I mean, as they say, everybody knows that, no? But very few thought to ask, was there anything before Pandukabhaya? Very few thought to ask, was there anything that brought wealth to this country other than growing rice in the paddy fields? It needed the work of archaeologists like, say, Siran Dernekal and his team, whose excavations in Anuradhapura have shown significant evidence of human habitation prior to the arrival of Vijaya and the people from the South Indian Pandu kingdom. Also, we now have credible evidence of an early Iron Age culture in the Anuradhapura region that dates to around 900 BC. Yesterday, I was happy to listen to a talk by Ishan Gunasekara, who showed us a slide of a place called Girahandusaya near Trinco, where there was a shrine built during the lifetime of the Buddha with houses some relics. Now, if that shrine and the story of the Buddha coming and sorting out a dispute between two brothers in the north about a jewel throne, if those are true, then that doesn't give credibility to the story of Vijaya coming to a land of snakes and demons. So we just believed what we were told. And only recently have we started to question and say, hey, the evidence doesn't show that. And I'll talk about the nautical thing in a little while because that is, yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of evidence, right? So your book, you rely on archaeology, literary sources, but also like following etymology and oral histories, right? How did you, briefly if you can share, how did you go about finding those sources?
Sometimes when you're interested in something, you notice a bit of information here and you can trace it up. Now, Google is a very good source of finding out where to look if you know where to look. Sometimes I have patients who come, they come to see me, to consult me after they have consulted Dr. Google. And then I tell them, look, you have looked at this website which is not credible. If you are looking, look at the correct place. So, using the internet now gives you a lot of information. And if you know where to look and how to follow up leads. You talked about etymology. And yeah, may I read something from the book? Thanks. This is how words can carry historical meanings. On this Silk Road trip, when we visited Oman, we were taken to visit the ruins of the ancient port of Samram in the Korori area. Founded in the 3rd century BC, it was one of the major centers where frankincense, which you all know is one of those gifts that the wise men brought to give baby Jesus in the Christian story, where frankincense was made and exported. So while the team of scholars were being shown the frankincense trees and the ruins of the port at Samram, Professor Paolo Costa, who was the chief archaeologist there, a thought suddenly struck me. And I was wondering, should I tell Paolo and the team about this? Then I thought, no, I'll tell them. It was not based on any scientific research or reading I had done, but I put my hand up and said, Paolo, may I say something which I just recalled while you were telling us how Samram was a major port from which frankincense reached the world. In my country, Sri Lanka, the word we use for frankincense is Samrani. And that suggests to me it would have come to Sri Lanka from Samram. Just like we talk about, she's wearing a Kashmir. She was wearing beautiful Kanjipuram. We use the names of the places where things came from to denote those things, no? And so, Paolo looked at me. That is very significant what you just told me. It existed as a port from the 3rd century BC to about the 4th century of the current era. So if the incense is called Samran in your country, it would imply that this came by ship from Samram to your country. Thank you, my friend. Thank you. This is the clue from ordinary life that gives credence to academic research. Just a simple thing I remembered from my grandmother's house in rural Sri Lanka. But to the understanding person, it gave such a lot of information. That is etymology. Then, if you talk about archaeological sources, there's a lot of groundbreaking work being done these days by young Sri Lankan archaeologists. For example, there's exploration of the shipwreck site at Godavaya, which is off the coast of Hambantota, and they found the ruins of a ship dated between 100 before the Christian era and 100 of the Common Era. There's the use of LIDAR technology. LIDAR stands for light detection and ranging, which is simply a method where you take a drone, the drone is flown over an area, they send laser pulses and you can map out what is under the ground. And I'm very happy to see the acting US ambassador here because she comes from the University of Texas in Austin. Thank you, Jane, for coming. Because the University of Austin has done a lot, it's a pioneer in this LIDAR technology, and they've identified places around the jungles in Mexico which show evidence of Mayan cities. So these are being done in Sri Lanka. And putting into practice this idea of there are 3 ways of learning. You can read, but sometimes books you read are boring. You can talk to people who know what they're doing. And I use this opportunity to talk to marine archaeologist Rasika Muthukumar. He is involved in this Godavaya exploration. There's another young historian called Krishan Mendis. He has used LIDAR technology here to plot out the area around Balana Fort. So there's a lot of scope in the future for finding out things. If you're prepared to share your knowledge with others, others will share their knowledge with you.
So this is a popular history book, right? In the sense that it's really, really deliciously accessible, right? Anyone can read it and understand what's going on. But in making it so accessible, were there things you had to leave out, things that you had to kind of flatten, that you want to elaborate on now?
Okay, thank you for that description. What you say, it's a deliciously readable book. Lovely. That's very kind of you to say that. What I did was, you see, I've been a medical academic for many years and I've written a few research papers. And I've realized that when you do research and write a research paper in an academic journal, it's only read by academics who will go to the library and read that book. Only people interested in that particular field. Normal, intelligent people don't get a chance to read this. And so the work of researchers doesn't really get known by normal people. A good example, in 1954, there was a landmark study done in England. Richard Dole and Bradford Hill in Oxford proved beyond any significant doubt that cigarette smoking was associated with lung cancer. The study was published in a prestigious medical journal, but it didn't reach the mainstream consciousness till about the 1970s. And cancer rates from lung cancer dropped only about 20 years later. So if we can get what we learn from research, what we learn from academia, and get it out to normal people to understand and put into practice, to appreciate what was taking place in Sri Lanka in the distant past. We were not just people growing rice and sitting on our haunches. So this is why I wrote the book in a way that it would be understandable by non-historians and non-archaeologists. I put in a few stories about Samram and Paolo. There's another nice story about my friend Musa in Muscat in Oman. Again, etymology. To make it readable and, as you said, what? Deliciously accessible. Thank you.
Yeah. Right. Now, another way that it's quite accessible is that you don't rely solely on expert sources. And there's a lot of oral history in there. I was wondering if you could particularly speak about the shipbuilder, because that really struck me. And why you think it's important to have, non-expert sources talking about this history and informing people about it.
Thank you, that's a good question. Because I came yesterday for Anchal Malhotra's talk. I hope somewhere over here. And she said at the time she started going to oral history, that was not a credible primary source. Because the academics, what people talk about and know is not very important. But what I discovered is that talking to people gives you a lot of information. Say, for example, in the book, I spoke about my friend Lieutenant Commander Devendra. He was a lovely man. He was a Navy officer who subsequently became interested in Sri Lankan history. And the chapter in my book about Sri Lanka's nautical heritage was, I think, I have to give him most of the credit for that. He told me what he knew, gave me access to places. And I asked him, how did they make the ships that we talk about? That is a model of an ocean-going Sri Lankan ship. A story behind that. Commander Devendra met this monk at the Pirivena, and he had this model of a ship. The monk's father, as a little boy, had made a model of a ship that was owned by his father, which used to sail from Sri Lanka to Maldives, Pakistan, and these are the ships that were ocean-going. And if you like, if there's time, we can talk about ocean-going ships. And so, Commander Devendra, he said, when I asked how did they have the blueprint for making these ships, because there are no records, he had asked one of the chief boat builders, how do you make the ship? And in answer, the boat builder recited some Sanskrit slokas to Commander Devendra. Slokas are mnemonic verses in Sanskrit. Ayurvedic physicians memorize them to learn their profession. And there was nothing in writing. Everything was in the head of the boat builder in the form of verses that are easy to memorize and easy to recall, the size of the ship, all the proportions and things. That's one. The second thing you asked about oral history, the specialized knowledge that is stored in the memory of expert cooks. You know, those aunties and archies who make delicious food and don't share their recipes with other aunties and archies. Because I'm not a cook, I was told about these. And this is how you learn, hey, why do we use semolina flour in love cake and not refined flour? Simple question, but it comes from the Portuguese. What's the difference between Indian burfi and Sri Lankan milk toffee? Why are patties the shape the way they are? And one more thing about oral history. A friend of mine who's done a lot of work on the music of the Afro-Sri Lankan community in the north of Sri Lanka, Shihan De Silva Jayasuriya, she has preserved oral history because she was talking to one of the ladies and that lady said, Dr. Shihan, we have nothing to say when our ancestors came, why they came here, where they came from. The only thing we have are the stories we know and the music that was taught to us.
Thank you so much, and thank you for listening.
Thank you. Sorry I had too much information to put in that short time, but thanks a lot, Mimi.